Thank you so much for coming to Flyleaf Books to hear authors Patricia Bryan and Thomas Wolfe discuss their new book, The PLEA. Patricia is a graduate of Charleston College and the University of Iowa College of Law. She also has a master's in tax degree from NYU. She co-authored Midnight Assassin, A Murder in America's Heartland with Thomas Wolfe. She co-edited America, A Jury of Her Peers and Other Stories, a collection of short stories by Susan Glassville. And she also co-authored tonight's book, also with Thomas Wolfe, The PLEA, the true story of young Wesley Elkins and his struggle for redemption, which was published July of this year. Thomas Wolfe is a graduate of Knox College and the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. Tom is also a longtime resident of Java Hill, and he has been a Vista volunteer, a community college teacher, a bookstore clerk, and an educational consultant. He co-authored, as I previously mentioned, Midnight Assassin with Patricia, and he also wrote a book called a book called The Cult Shot, Babe Ruth and the Chicago Cubs, and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, Marella. I think that Marella said I could do this without the microphone, so I think I'm going to just shout. If that's okay with everyone. It's easier for me, and if in the back, Mike or Danny, if you can't hear me, raise your hand and I'll shout louder. So first of all, I want to say we very much appreciate Flyleaf for making this event possible. Independent bookstores, as well as libraries, have really been crucial both for readers and writers during the pandemic, and really at all times in terms of getting books the attention that they deserve. So thanks very much, first of all, to Flyleaf for hosting this event. I want to start by doing a little background on how we discovered the story of Wesley Elkins and how we became interested in it, and why we committed quite a bit of time and a number of years to researching the book and then to writing it. So in the fall, we go all the way back to the fall of 2000, 22 years ago, which is really when we first began thinking about Wesley. In that year, Patricia was teaching at the University of Iowa College of Law. So we were in Iowa City, and at the time we were researching another book. We were researching a book that was also a murder in Iowa from 1900, a murder that had happened in the Iowa farmhouse. A man by the name of John Hossack was murdered in the middle of the night. His wife, Margaret, was arrested and charged with that murder and eventually convicted and sent to prison at Anamosa State Penitentiary in Iowa. Since Patricia and I were in Iowa City and 20 miles away from Anamosa, we were able to arrange a tour of the prison and be able to see where Margaret had served her time. So really in doing the research for that earlier book is what eventually led us to Wesley Elkins. And the reason for that is that as we got the tour at Anamosa State Penitentiary, we were in the company of two counselors who worked there, who were also historians who were kind of keeping the history of the institution alive. And they told us that they had a number of stories in addition to Margaret Hossack that we might be interested in. And they had some famous inmates. One of the most famous inmates was an outlaw named Poke Wells, who you might have heard of. And they also had at one point the future mass murderer, John Wayne Gacy, as an inmate at this particular institution. So those were interesting to us, and the basic history of the institution was also interesting, but it was two lesser stories that really caught our attention. One was about a man named Harry Hortman, who was a lifer. He was incarcerated from about age 24 till his death at age 55. He was a model prisoner, and most notably, he was a Cubs fan. And the prison warden at that time was also a Cubs fan, so they bonded. And this warden took the prisoner to the World Series in 1932, where the prisoner, the lifer, Harry Hortman, was able to see games 3 and 4 of the 1932 World Series, and he saw in person Babe Ruth's call shot home run. As a baseball fan, that story really interested me. The other story that was of interest to us was that of Wesley Elkins. In 1890, Wesley had been sentenced to life in prison for confessing to the murders of his father and stepmother in Clayton County, Iowa. And at the time of his incarceration, Wesley was 11 years old. He weighed 70 pounds, was 4'7". He was a child, and he was sentenced to life in prison at an adult prison. So we were interested in Wesley at that point, and remember this is December of 2000. But we hadn't finished our book about the Hasek murder. So that took our time, that took us the next 5 or 6 years to put that book together. And then eventually we went back to the story of Wesley Elkins. Patricia went back to it first. I worked on Harry Hortman in the baseball book. Patricia went back and began to do what became several years of research into Wesley's life, what had happened to him when he was in prison, his attempts to gain his freedom. And Patricia wrote an article that was published in the Annals of Iowa History Journal that told the story of Wesley, the early part of Wesley's life and his incarceration. Let me just use that as background and now go to actually reading from the book. This is the way the book opens, chapter 1. On Wednesday, July 17th, 1889, John Porter, a 61-year-old Iowa farmer, stood in his yard outside the farmhouse where he lived just as the sun was rising. He looked out at his fields, 120 acres of fertile and undulating Iowa farmland. He sensed it would be a brutally hot day. As the sky lightened, Porter's reverie was interrupted by the clatter of a one-horse buggy coming down the dirt road that passed in front of his house. Porter saw the horse first, and then the buggy came into view. A child was sitting high on the wooden seat, holding the reins. Porter recognized the boy as Wesley Elkins, the 11-year-old son of his neighbor, John Elkins. Porter was well acquainted with the Elkins family, who owned, and John Elkins, who owned and operated a local sawmill on the banks of Bear Creek, a tributary of the Iowa River. John Elkins, who was 45 years old, had rented a house on Porter's land. Across from the mill, he lived there with his third wife, Hattie, 23 years old, their 1-year-old daughter, Nellie, and Wesley, John's son from a previous marriage. As the buggy approached the gate to his yard, Porter shouted to the boy, motioning for him to stop. Porter opened the gate, and Wesley steered the buggy up to the house and brought the horse to a halt. Wesley was wearing work clothes, overalls, and a striped shirt. Although the sun was barely up, the boy had a dirty white felt hat pulled low over his eyes. As Porter stepped closer, he could see an infant tightly wrapped in a blanket lying on the wooden seat next to Wesley. When Porter asked Wesley where he was headed, Wesley responded that he was taking the baby to Hattie's parents, who lived a few miles away. Then he needed to fetch his older brother, Mark, who was boarding at the Woodall farm nearby. And then, in a quiet voice, Wesley said he had to tell Mark that their father and stepmother had been killed by an intruder a few hours earlier. Wesley didn't know who had done it, but he had seen the bodies in the bedroom, and he was sure they were dead. Porter couldn't believe what he had heard, but he didn't ask any questions. He told Wesley to leave the baby with him and to drive immediately to get his brother Mark. Wesley nodded, and he lifted the baby and handed her out to Porter. As the boy leaned forward, Porter saw that Wesley's face and shirt were spotted with dark red flecks that looked like dried blood. With the baby in his arms, John Porter watched Wesley turn the horse around and drive the buggy through the gate out to the road. Wesley stopped briefly, and when he climbed down from his perch and walked back to close the heavy gate behind him, Porter noticed that the boy was barefoot. Wesley returned to his seat, and the buggy continued down the road, receding into the distance. John Porter hurried inside to wake his family and tell them about his conversation with Wesley. Porter and his 24-year-old son, George, agreed that they had to go down to the Elkins house to investigate. Leaving the baby at the house with Porter's wife, Harriet, father and son made their way along the narrow road to the Elkins house 3/4 of a mile away. The land was hilly, with cultivated fields of oats and corn separated by patches of dense woods. The path twisted through a strand of trees, and the thick branches overhead blocked the early morning sun as Bear Creek flowed nearby. Porter knew this road well. He had visited John Elkins just the day before, and now, less than 12 hours later, Porter was again approaching the Elkins house, which stood isolated on top of a small rise. From a distance, nothing looked unusual. The barn, about 250 feet northwest of the house, was on lower ground and mostly hidden from view. It was larger than the house, with enough space for Elkins to keep his animals: 2 horses, a milk cow, a steer, and a calf. An ill-tempered dog often roamed about the property, but he was nowhere in sight. As a reporter for the local newspaper later wrote, the Elkins house was, quote, favorably located for the commission of a terrible crime, since no sounds or screams would reach the ears of those in the valley below, unquote. John Porter and his son called out as they got closer. When no one responded, they knocked and tried to open the front door. It was locked. So they went around to the back, and that door yielded to their touch and opened. The house was small, 16 feet by 20 feet, with only 3 rooms. The men entered the largest one, which was sparsely furnished, with a table and chairs, a chest with a clock on it, a cook stove, and a sewing machine. Along the wall were doors to the 2 bedrooms, each about 8 feet by 9 feet, barely large enough to fit a bed and a chest. Those doors were ajar, and taking only a few steps, the men could see inside the room that John and Hattie occupied. The thin curtains on the windows were drawn closed, and the room was in half darkness. Porter entered the room and drew close enough to be sure that 2 were dead, and then he turned to the adjacent bedroom. It had a small bed, big enough for only 1 person, and the bedclothes were disturbed and spotted with blood. There was a single-barrel rifle hanging by 2 leather straps at the foot of the bed and a small chest nearby. A lamp, a powder horn with a stopper out, and a few bullets lay on top of the chest. Porter stepped into the room and briefly inspected the rifle. When he hit the muzzle against the floor, some grains of powder came out, but no bullet had been loaded into the chamber. It looked to Porter as if someone had started to load the rifle and was interrupted in the task. He couldn't imagine that Elkins would have left his rifle in that condition. John Porter and his son talked briefly outside. They agreed that Porter would stay with the bodies while his son alerted the community and reported the murder to the authorities. So once the body was discovered, and Porter was aware of it, we have Wesley Elkins in the buggy going to pick up his brother John, George Porter, the son, going to alert the neighbors. In a few hours, the county sheriff and the county coroner were notified, and they arrived at the scene. 3 men were selected from the neighbors to serve as an inquest jury, and the coroner's inquest took place that afternoon. 2 doctors arrived, they examined the bodies, and reported their findings to the members of the inquest jury. Neighbors were questioned. Mark Elkins and Wesley Elkins were questioned. Wesley was questioned 3 times, in fact. Both of the Elkins boys were considered suspects. Mark had an alibi, and Wesley just seemed to be too young to have committed the crime, and claimed and maintained his innocence, claiming to be asleep in the barn when an intruder had entered the house. 8 days after the murders, Wesley confessed and was arrested, and in January of 1890, he was sentenced as an adult to life in prison at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. The residents of Clayton County, shocked first by the crime and then by Wesley's admission of guilt, could not understand how such a small and innocent-seeming boy could have committed this crime. So they settled on a simple explanation. Wesley Elkins was innately evil and likely to kill again. More than a decade later, a local minister came forward. He had known the Elkins family, and he described what he knew of Wesley's home life. The minister wrote these words: Wesley was a sadly neglected child who was threatened and beaten and cursed at home by his parents, especially by his father. Surely his life as a child had not a ray of light or joy. His little life was crushed, and every legitimate aspiration was broken down by hard and cruel home treatment. So that gives us a window into understanding a little bit about the crime, understanding the circumstances that the crime occurred. And I'm going to turn it over to Patricia at this point to tell you some more about the Wesley Elkins story.
And I think I'm going to shout also. I teach sometimes large classes, so I do have a very loud voice, I think. But if you can't hear me, let me know, and I'll certainly turn on the microphone. I want to thank Flyleaf very much for having us here, and to echo Tom's recommendation of going to independent bookstores. It really makes such a difference during this time. I know it's so easy to, as many of us have talked about, to just click Amazon, but I think it really does make a difference to the community, to the booksellers, and ultimately to all of us if we buy from Flyleaf and from other independent booksellers. All right, I want to talk a little bit about what happened to Wesley after the bodies were discovered. And as Tom said, many people suspected him of the crime, but it was 8 days until he was arrested. And by that time, Wesley had confessed to the murders. He had done that when he was in a buggy in the company of one man, a lawyer, James Corlett, who had gotten him to go with him under the pretense that he was taking him to a local baseball game. Before he left with the boy, Corlett told the sheriff that he was convinced that Wesley was lying, and he was determined to obtain a confession. He wanted the $500 reward, quite a lot in those days, that had been offered in order if you brought the attacker to justice. Now, we don't know exactly what happened in that buggy, but we do know that it passed by the side of a site where Corlett, as county recorder, had witnessed an execution just a few weeks prior. And we know that he admitted that he stopped the buggy and he described to Wesley exactly what he had seen. He had seen the gallows, he had seen the black hood tied tightly around the guilty man's neck, and then he had watched as the trap door opened, sending the man to his death. It's pretty clear that Corlett wanted to frighten the young boy into confessing, and he was able to do just that. Corlett was in a hurry to return to the magistrate to get that reward and to get the arrest warrant signed. So we don't know that Wesley did more than simply confirm that he had committed the murders and that he had acted alone. Corlett admitted that he had pen and paper at the ready. He kept the buggy stopped. And so it seemed to us most likely that what Corlett did was to produce the paper that he had prepared beforehand and give it to Wesley to sign his name. The next day, however, Corlett released to the newspapers a lengthy statement, 3 paragraphs in length. It covered an entire newspaper column. Now, he attributed it to Wesley, although slightly different versions were printed in different newspapers. But they were all organized and chronological, and they described in great detail how Wesley had found and hidden the club beforehand, how he had waited until his victims were dead. He had proceeded in a methodical and cold-blooded fashion, and then he had lied to the community after waiting to be sure that they were dead. Would an 11-year-old boy launch into a monologue when he was alone in a buggy with an adult who was clearly not on his side? It seems unlikely to us. In fact, later Corlett admitted that he had not transcribed the words that Wesley had spoken. It would have been easy for Corlett to imagine what Wesley had done and to write that down. He knew, he had followed the investigation, so he knew what the evidence was that had been found, and as a lawyer, he was well aware of the components that needed to be proved for first-degree murder. The confession, after Wesley confessed to the murders, few people doubted that he had done it and that he had acted alone. But the confession produced by Corlett made it clear that he knew what he was doing, that he had the intent to kill them, and that he fully understood the magnitude of what he had done. He had lied, and he had hidden the truth from the people who had tried to sympathize with him. Those who had believed Wesley now felt motivated and felt that they had been manipulated and tricked. They would not forget that. They joined the others who, from the beginning, had believed that the boy was innately evil and depraved. He had an uncontrollable criminal nature, and as Tom said, they felt sure that he would murder again. Wesley was housed in the county jail until the sentencing hearing in January. At that point, the lawyer who had been assigned to defend him had taken himself off the case. He had told the judge he was simply too repelled to continue to defend Wesley. So James Crosby, a young lawyer who had just recently been admitted to the bar, agreed to serve. Now, Crosby knew the death penalty was unlikely. In fact, there were only 2 children who had been executed prior to this time. One of them, in fact, was 10 years old when he had committed the crime. He wasn't actually executed until 13 years after that. But Crosby told Wesley that unless he pleaded guilty to the crime as charged, he would be hanged. Crosby was the only adult who spoke to Wesley, and so Wesley agreed. He stood up in court, admitted that he had done exactly what the confession said. The judge convicted him of first-degree murder, and as Tom said, he sent him to prison for life, sending him to Anamosa State Penitentiary that housed the most dangerous criminals in the state. When Wesley got to Anamosa, Marquis Barr, father of 6 children, one child who was the same age as Wesley, in fact, was the warden. And I want to read what Barr said about that first meeting. Barr had followed the case in the newspapers. He knew that Wesley was only 11 years old, and yet he was astonished by the boy's appearance. Given the violence of the murders, he had not expected to see such a slight and immature child standing before him. Wesley was small and frail, with delicate features and a manner that seemed almost feminine. Barr later described that first meeting in his office. "I cannot express my feelings when I first saw him. My heart was filled with pity and sympathy. He looked thin, pale, and weak. He had a slight twitching of the head and eyes. He looked sad. When spoken to, would answer promptly and intelligently, but he seldom commenced a conversation. Morally, he was a mystery, and had it not been for the fact that he had pleaded guilty to a heinous crime, my answer would have been morally good." For the next After speaking to Wesley, Barr was convinced of two things. He was sure that Wesley had been neglected and abused as a child, and he was also convinced that Wesley did not understand the magnitude of what he had done. Fearing for Wesley's safety, he decided to separate Wesley from the rest of the convicts and assigned him to work in the prison library. That was a momentous change for the boy. He had learned how to read when he was young and in school, before he was taken out of school by his father, and he worked his way through volumes of history, philosophy, and literature. Later, the wardens he dealt with through the years said his educational progress was phenomenal. Now, something big happened to Wesley when he was 14 years old. I want to read that part from the book. The library contained a few shelves of legal volumes. Some of the more educated prisoners spent time researching their appeals, and they shared information with others. Prisoner lawyers, jailhouse lawyers is what they're called. In the fall of 1892, when Wesley was 14, he received a tip from one of the prisoners who had found a published opinion from the Iowa Supreme Court in 1878. The case, State versus Fowler, looked like it might be a favorable precedent. The facts were simple enough. During recess, a schoolboy named Silas Fowler had used a slingshot to fire a rock at George Reith, a classmate. The rock struck Reith on the head, and Reith suffered a slight but bloody wound. Fowler was indicted, convicted of assault, and fined $25 and court costs. His lawyers appealed his conviction to the Iowa Supreme Court. The significance to Wesley came from a legal principle quoted in the case, which was accepted by all parties as an accurate statement of the law. The judge and the lawyers on both sides agreed that under common law, a child between the ages of 7 and 14 must be presumed to be incapable of committing any crime. The presumption could be rebutted only if the state could prove that the child had sufficient capacity to comprehend what he had done. Without such convincing proof, a child of 14 or younger had to be acquitted. Now, the common law rule, as Wesley understood, had been well established years before Wesley pled guilty to the murders of his parents. While lawyers in other cases had raised the infancy defense on behalf of their young clients, relying on the presumption that a child should be acquitted, James Crosby had never cited that rule. Although there was little doubt that Wesley had killed his parents, Crosby might have challenged the confession attributed to Wesley as insufficient evidence of malice aforethought. Wesley was an uneducated child at the time, and yet the statement produced by James Crosby was meticulous and exhaustive. Even if Wesley had acknowledged some of the statements, some of the specific statements, he may have been responding to leading questions asked by Hortman. Hortman's account was the only evidence that the boy had acted with true criminal intent. Should that have been sufficient to overcome the presumption of innocence? Crosby had not raised that question. In a later statement to a reporter, Crosby declared that he had concluded almost immediately that Wesley had murder in his heart and would engage in his murderous propensity at the least provocation. Crosby, like the rest of the community, was so appalled by the crime that he was convinced he had concluded early on that life imprisonment was the only appropriate punishment. Crosby had ignored the fact that Wesley was an 11-year-old child. After reading State v. Fowler, Wesley understood that ineffective counsel could be a basis for release from prison. A petition would have to be filed with the federal court asking for a writ of habeas corpus, a long-established protection against unlawful detention. A few prisoners, often with financial help from their families, had hired outside lawyers to pursue their appeals, and Wesley saw that as his best chance. He had saved the pittance he had earned from his labor over the last 3 years, and he went directly to Warden Madden with his request. Madden wasn't sure how to proceed. In October 1892, he wrote to Governor Horace Boyes for advice. Madden wrote that the boy has placed $20 in our hands with instructions to send it to an attorney to aid him. He thinks he can get out on a writ of habeas corpus. What shall I do about it? Whether or not the governor responded, Wesley was not provided with legal counsel. No one told Wesley that a petition filed more than a year after he was imprisoned would probably have been dismissed as untimely. Although Wesley must have accepted that habeas corpus was not his best path to freedom, he did not forget the suggestion that his conviction and life sentence were unjust. For the next 8 years, Wesley fought for his release. Now, under Iowa law at the time, the governor could not decide on his own to parole a lifer convicted of first-degree murder. He had to forward an application to the General Assembly for debate. And at the same time, he had to notify the public that the General Assembly would decide the fate of the prisoner. Prisoners could apply for parole only once every 2 years. Wesley applied for parole 4 times during the next 8 years, and each time it ignited a firestorm of controversy. Wesley, in fact, was his own best advocate. He wrote eloquent and emotional letters to be published in a newspaper. Wardens spoke up to support his release. They cited his excellent behavior and announced that he had been fully rehabilitated. Respected men and legislators visited Wesley in prison. They were impressed by his intellect and his maturity, and they publicly declared their support. Social reformers held up Wesley as a model to prove that adult guidance and a positive environment could help a child to develop a moral consciousness. And yet Clayton County residents were vocal and strong in their opposition. They lined up to sign petitions against Wesley's release. Wesley's lawyer, Crosby, in fact, was eager to state his case, to justify what he had done. He labeled Wesley as dangerous and evil, that he would no doubt kill again. He warned the community that if Wesley were allowed to multiply and reproduce, he would infect the community. Local newspapers wrote of his morbid, beastly nature. They said that the childlike appearance masked a dangerous, innate criminal. An inborn criminal, they said, could not be cultivated. So we tell the story of these appeals in the book, and it's no spoiler to say that Wesley was eventually paroled. That's not, however, the end of the story. One of our greatest, most fortunate discoveries was that Wesley was required under the terms of his parole to write 1 letter every month for the next 10 years to the governor. All of those letters were located in boxes in the Iowa Historical Archives, and they had never been opened before. When I found out about them, I wrote to the archivist pleading my case that I should be able to open them, and he agreed. So we were fortunate to have Wesley's own words. We were able to follow the path of, Wesley lived, I should say, for 59 years after he was released from prison. He died at the age of 81, and we were able to trace his path through census records, through other public documents. But we were fortunate to have the letters so that Wesley himself could tell the story of a good part of his second chance at life. I'm eager. Tom and I are both eager to take questions, if there are. Yes, John.
You said the actual letters were still in the envelopes. The governor had never opened them when they arrived?
In fact, they were not in the envelopes, but and some of them have been copied. Wesley had written most of them longhand. Some of them, a few of them, have been typed. What was really frustrating for us was that on the top of them a little notation said answered, but there was no way that we could find the answers. And I will say Wesley's letters were somewhat brief. I mean, they told what he was doing. Occasionally he lapsed into sort of an emotional state and told what he was afraid of, what he was dealing with. And occasionally he referred to the governor's answers. But we don't have those. We don't have the envelopes. We do have the return address. But we do know, just because they were in this sealed box, they had not been opened before. So that was, you know, an enormous find for us.
These letters, my kids' letters from camp.
Are you saving those, did you say?
It's like not much information, but a lot of emotional.
Right. It is either your biography, John, or their biography that's going to be helpful. Yeah, Melissa.
Could you talk about the pictures on the cover?
Yeah, sure. There are several pictures that are actually embedded in the book. The picture, I'll answer this and then you can answer the next. The picture on the top is interesting because it was taken, we're certain, we found it in the Iowa, at Anamosa Prison. And it was taken when Wesley was 22, right before, when he was still in the prison, before he was released. And he stands there with his legs crossed, looking straight at the camera. He's dressed well, as you can see. First time he's been out of his prison garb. And looking, as I say, right at the camera. He looks young. He's 22 years old. The other picture is of Anamosa in 1902. Am I right about that?
I'm not sure. Early 1900s.
We were really lucky to get several other pictures from Anamosa. If you have the book and you look at page 42, you can see the picture of Wesley Elkins that was published in Iowa at the time of the crime. He looks really young. You know, he looks like a schoolboy, really. He wore, as Tom said, 5'7".
4'7".
4 foot, yeah, 4. He was not taller than me. 4'7". He weighed 70 pounds. He wore size 4.
Size 4 boots.
Size 4 boots. It's interesting because in the prison record they say marital status single. And there are also a couple of pictures that we were able to find from his college yearbooks. And so, it's with the other men and Wesley. So we have identified Wesley. So we have those 4 pictures of him. I think that's all.
Yeah, and the picture that's on the cover, the full picture, is on page 139.
You mean the Anamosa picture?
No,
the full picture of
the
him.
full picture of him sitting in the library right before he's released. We think he's holding his parole papers in his hand. That he was photographed the day that he was leaving.
Yeah, and I will also give a little plug for the Anamosa historical history.
The prison
site.
history site.
Steve Wendell, who is one of our friends, who was a counselor at the prison, has maintained this site, which is incredible. With the pictures, I mean, it has pictures of the prisoners in their dining hall in the early 18th century, I suppose, or early 19th century. They could only communicate by way of hand signals, and the guards were at the end with spittoons. So you see pictures at all times of the prison. I really recommend that you look at it. It's what is it called? And we cited
The
that.
Anamosa Prison website,
Yeah,
history website.
really terrific in the number of stories they have and the number of pictures. Yeah, Bob.
You don't suggest in anything. First of all, I don't want to do spoil things. I want to read this book. But you don't suggest at any point that he was innocent.
No.
So does he discuss why he did this in those letters or in other things?
He says that he was driven to this act because of the way he was treated, and he mentions that a couple of times in letters. And he does say, within a few years after he was in prison, he writes a letter and explains that he is sorry for what he had done, wishes he didn't do it. So he does express some regret and remorse.
Yeah, and I will say, in all of everything he said before he was released, he doesn't really blame his parents. I mean, he talks about his being abused, but his main points are that he was young and immature at the time, and he was fully rehabilitated and ready to join society. So he does say that he was abused, but I think he's careful not to blame his parents. Not that legislators didn't, who were arguing for him, but, and he never repudiated or said that he had not done it. Yeah, do read the book, Bob. Still a few surprises. Yeah, Laura.
I'm only halfway through the book, but I was really surprised how progressive the first two books were. Did that surprise? I mean, because they seemed modern, and it also, obviously, on so many levels, grappling with the same issues that we're getting grappling with in our state today, which is like, did that surprise you? Of the two words?
I suppose it surprised me just because I didn't know the history of that era. So as we did the research, I mean, it did become apparent that the prison wardens, the prison system was very different than what we see today. It's not like the Tombs in New York. It's not a country club, but there was a recognition on the part of wardens and others who worked in the prison chaplain, the prison matron. They believed people could be rehabilitated. And maybe the criminals were had committed less serious crimes than many of the crimes that people are in prison for today, too. But I think that they saw the general population in the prison as redeemable.
Well, and I'll also say that prison philosophy was going through a real change at the time, because certainly with the Puritans, and even after that, the idea was we need to punish these people as a kind of deterrence. You know, that it's free will, that they're committing it, and we have to prove to other people that you'll get your just desserts. And a new group of wardens really came into service. They saw themselves as professionals. They wanted to prove that they could rehabilitate prisoners, and I think they saw Wesley as a model. You know, Wesley was someone who would go out into society and would look well for them. So, they thought, well, they could really tell who was incorrigible and who was not. And they paid attention to their prisoners. I mean, you can think how different that is from what happens today. And really how different that was from what happened before this. So Wesley, was fortunate that he had prison guards and wardens who really mentored him. Yeah, Grace.
Did he ever return to Clayton County? And if he did, how was the reception?
One of the conditions of him being released was that he never go back to Clayton County.
And not that he wanted to.
And Patricia can speak to the legal aspects, but I believe he was sentenced for one of the murders, but the other murder was still held over him, and people in Clayton County said if he came back, they would charge him with that murder. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, well, I have to ask Bob about that. I've learned enough criminal law, but I'm not a criminal law expert. But what I understand is that he pled guilty to only one murder, which was the murder of his father. And according to Clayton County residents, he could still be indicted. Is that right? That's what they said, for the murder of his mother. And if he ever came back to Clayton County, he would have that hanging over him. I don't know. Is there a statute of...
In lots of jurisdictions, there is no statute of limitations for first-degree murder. Most people don't know it, but in North Carolina, there's no statute of limitations for any felony. And so...
Yeah, one other point to Grace. I mean, he didn't want to go back to Clayton County, of course. But we went to Clayton County to do research. And I found a deputy sheriff that I interviewed, and I said, well, do you know about the Wesley Elkins case? Just curious if what he would say 130 years after the case. He said, that little bastard who killed his parents. So the sentiment was still there, still lingering. So we're very interested, because we're doing a reading in El Cader, and the county seat of Clayton County on November 6th, and we hope to survive it.
Milbury.
Do you know, I haven't gotten very far in the book yet, do you know if he had any further relationship with his siblings and half-siblings?
Oh, you know, that's a really interesting question. And yes, he did. His sister, we know, wrote to him in prison. They didn't show up at the inquest. And we don't know anything about them right after the crime. But his sister did write to him in prison and say that she would give him a home if he could be released. She would take him into her home and make him part of her family in Minnesota. And in fact, after Wesley was released, he really made an effort to get in touch with the other siblings, the siblings of his father that he had killed. Unfortunately, we don't know anything about the baby. You know, Wesley said that he had taken the baby who was lying between the parents after he had killed them and changed her. As he said, he liked the baby and he didn't want to kill the baby. But we don't know what happened to her. But he also got in touch with his birth mother, had left his father and had created another family. And he actually moved them to Minnesota and supported them. So Wesley was really looking for connection. He didn't marry. He did marry. He did not have children. Perhaps that's not surprising. But he did connect with his family, and he made very close relationships with them. And that's, you know, that's interesting to us. But he sought connection.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Milbury, and then John.
Follow-up question is, how did the minister know that there was abuse in the household? Do we know anything about that?
We know from the testimony of a couple of neighbors that there were rumors in the neighborhood, you know, the immediate neighborhood, that Wesley was being abused. That came out at the inquest, coroner's inquest. There was testimony about that. One of the neighbors who had told someone else that they thought Wesley was being abused said under oath, well, no, that really probably wasn't happening. But I think it was pretty clear from our research that it was known. I mean, the issue of family privacy was that it wasn't going to be discussed. But it was
no one was going to interfere.
No one was going to interfere. We do know that Wesley ran away once and tried to get out of the clutches of his family. He was brought back, eaten. He had no escape. I mean, there was no safety net there. There was no social services. He had been pulled out of school at age 9 to work in the father's sawmill. So he didn't have teachers he could go to. But we do believe that the neighbors knew that to some extent he was being abused and physically abused at home.
And I'll also say the minister actually knew the family. He was a minister at a church not too far, and he had been friends with John Elkins. So he had visited the home and apparently had seen what was going on. And just one other thing about Wesley's life, he was moved around quite a bit. I mean, he started out living with his father. His birth mother gave birth to him, and then she left. He was left with his father. When his father remarried, he was transferred to his mother's. His mother had a new family. His mother died. He was sent back to his father, who did not want him. His father sent him to his grandmother, who also did not want him. He was sent back to his father, who his father and stepmother also made it clear that they did not want him. So by the time of 11, Wesley had lived, I think, 5 different places. And, you know, he had no real nurturing adult, which is also, you know, the sign of a child who is, to put it mildly, troubled in later life. John, you had a question?
I was just curious if they paid out the $500 reward.
Oh, that reward! Good question.
It apparently was never paid. We know that Corlett and at least 1, maybe 2 other people applied for the reward, saying that they had identified Wesley as the murderer, so they should get the reward, but the governor never paid it out. When we checked all the records that we could possibly find, so apparently it was never paid.
Well, you know, Corlett was determined to get it.
Yeah.
He kept on writing to the governor for probably the next 5 years. And he produced an affidavit from the sheriff saying that he was the first, but there were 2 other men, one on the inquest jury who had told the sheriff, don't let him go, and then another neighbor who also told the sheriff, don't let him go. But Corlett, you know, Corlett was a really ambitious man. He was running for a county seat, and he wanted to get his name before the public, but he also wanted to get that $500. And as far as we can tell, he was never successful, but not for a want of trying.
Karen.
You know, I found it that must have been just phenomenal when you found those letters and to read them. As being parents yourselves, and you know, you can research, but I think that reading his words really kind of brought you closer to him and an understanding. Did you feel pretty motherly and fatherly towards this? Because it's abuse. Clearly it was abuse that somebody would go to that length to kill somebody, but
yeah,
that must have been hard.
Tom?
I'm not sure I felt fatherly towards towards Wesley. What I was most struck by in the letters was his ability to write and to express deep thoughts. I mean, he was a very smart kid who was self-educated. I mean, he educated himself in prison. The best thing that ever happened to him in many ways was that he went to a prison with a library. Because he educated himself.
And got the mentors.
And got the mentors. And from his reading, I think he learned how to write. And his letters, which he wrote to newspapers and to other supporters around the state, were one of the main reasons, I think, that he got a hearing from the legislature, because they saw him through his letters as someone who was intelligent and redeemable. So I think that's the way I came to the letters. I thought, you know, these letters are great, and I didn't, you know, feel that bond with Wesley, but I was really glad to encounter someone whose writing was so progressive and I mean, it's just really well formed. And I think you'll see that later in the book because we quote a lot from the letters. We couldn't quote the whole 120, but
yeah. I think another thing about reading those letters, Karen, was that what really comes through is that Wesley is afraid that people are going to find out about what he did. And he was really trying hard to establish a new life. And he did. I mean, he made connections with his family. He had a successful career. Am I giving too much away for people who haven't finished yet? But, you know, he made good on his promises. But he did feel, not surprising, that if people found out what he had done, he would be shunned. And that's one of the most, at least to me, emotional parts of it. You know, that here's this person trying to make good, and yet he knows that something he did as a child is going to come back and haunt him. I mean, I have to admit, I did not really feel motherly about him because he did kill his parents, you know, in a violent way. So it took me a little while to feel sympathetic toward him. And it is interesting because during the time he was in prison, there was really a change in the way criminals were seen. You know, there was a new sense, it really came from social reformers, that a positive environment could make a difference. The children were at a very beginning level of consciousness, that, you know, it wasn't just set in stone. I mean, this whole notion of innate criminality, you know, that we still have nature versus nurture. But the fact that Wesley had been so young, the fact that he had done so well in prison, came about those ideas while Wesley was in prison. You know, the whole, what's called the child saver movement. Women suffragettes were concerned about children as well. So I think he came about at a good time, if any, you know, a better time. Things were changing. So that was good for Wesley. Yeah.
But I have the second question, that how, you know, when you have a history, how did he get into to Cornell College? Did they not know his background, or it just, can you get away with just not mentioning that?
Well, I'll leave that to Tom, but I will say Cornell College is not the one in Syracuse. It's a small college in Iowa. And you can tell how he got into.
Yeah, one of his advocates.
Don't let anybody in.
What, Danny?
Don't let anybody in.
Don't tell Wesley that.
One of Wesley's biggest supporters was a professor at Cornell College who advocated for Wesley with state legislators. And he was very well known in the state, a man named James Harlan. And Harlan said, if Wesley is released, you know, I'll take him into my home. So part of the conditions of Wesley being released was that he go to live on the campus of Cornell College. Now, Cornell College at that time, and Patricia remembers this better than I do, was also had an academy. So he was in the academy, which was more like a high school.
Even though he was 22.
Even though he was 24, I think, at the time. But yeah, everybody at Cornell knew about it, and that's one of the remarkable things that Patricia and I have commented on as we have talked about this case. He was in the debate society, he was elected president of the debate society. He was accepted by all those students at Cornell who knew his history. And that's kind of a remarkable thing. I don't know exactly how to account for it, but
he proved himself.
He proved himself.
I mean, he was intellectual, he was a leader,
yeah. He
was collegial.
Yeah.
So Morella is telling us that it's time. Yes, Morella? So it's been terrific for us.
Can't wait to read it.
Oh, well, good.